Thank you, Dick, Jim, and choir. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and the 21st chapter. It's on page 36 of that Believer's Study Bible in front of you, if you don't have a Bible with you. Mother's Day, those words have a warmth to them, and for many, they conjure up images of a Norman Rockwell kind of a world of decades gone by. A world in which life was a lot more simple, where every family lived in a nice, neat, trimmed yard behind a little white picket fence, where life was filled with family fun and picnic, and every Sunday morning folks walked down to that white framed steeple church on the corner and lived in the midst of a tranquil and calm and sterile environment. And of course, everybody lived happily ever after. But on Mother's Day 2006, we have awakened to a far different world than we did in Norman Rockwell's days, and Mother's Day 1956. We don't live at Disney World, where all the streets are swept spotless clean, where there's an ice cream stand on every corner. There are not a lot of happy faces and wide smiles at every turn, and the truth is we don't always all live happily ever after in a castle in some fantasy land. We live in the midst of a real world where on this Mother's Day, here in this room, and beyond it out there to the world in this city where we're called to reach, there are a bunch of folks, a bunch of mothers, on this day whose dreams are smashed and hopes dashed, and who are struggling and some hanging by a thread. The majority of mothers in our world work, 4/5 of them with school-age children. The challenge of the church is to build a wall as high as we can to keep people from falling off that cliff of destruction with the home. And at the same time, while holding up those high standards, to make sure we've got an ambulance down there at the bottom of the cliff to bandage up those whose lives have been wounded. In many ways, Mother's Day is a tough time for a lot of people. There are a lot of moms in the Bible we can hold up as role models today. In fact, I thought about preaching about that woman we read about in the scripture reading a moment ago, the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, who just does everything so perfectly right. But I thought that'd just make a bunch of people feel guilty on Mother's Day. And I thought about preaching on Naomi or Hannah, that sweet mother of prayer that saw God answer her prayers. Or the Shunammite woman, one of my favorite women in the scripture. Or even Mary or Ruth. But on this Mother's Day, in this world in which we live, I want to direct our attention to a woman that I'll guarantee you there's not one in a million sermons on Mother's Day that's going to be preached on this mother. She's almost lost in that beautiful story of Abraham and Sarah. You know, God promised Abraham that he would make his descendants as numerous as the sand of the sea. And he also one time at night said, Abraham, look up at the stars. And as Abraham did, he said, your seed are going to be numbered like those stars. And yet Abraham couldn't wait on God's promise. Sarah was barren. They couldn't have children. It didn't look like God was going to come through. And so Abraham took it upon himself to help God with this promise. And in his impatience and in his manipulation, he took a woman, Hagar, into his home, and they had a boy. Abraham, the great man of faith, made mistakes like all of us. And what I'd like to do on this Mother's Day is for us to focus upon this mother, because in Hagar today, we're going to see the plight of many modern mothers today. And not just many modern mothers, but we're going to see the plight of a lot of us. Her story begins in verse 14 of Genesis 21. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, that boy Ishmael, and sent her away. Those are haunting words. And yet there's some in this room and multiplied thousands in this city that have heard those words and experienced those words and have been rejected and sent away. There are a lot of children being raised in this city today without their dads, and it's not always the dad's fault. There are a lot of ways and a lot of places and a lot of cases where dad wants to be there. He sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. She's got no direction now. She's just out there wandering. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of my child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Any moms in here today that have separated yourself somewhere where your kid couldn't see you and have prayed for them and wept? This is what Hagar was doing. You know, a mom is not any happier than the happiness of one of her children. She can have 6, 8 kids, but if one of them's not happy, mom's not happy. And so she weeps. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you? What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Lift up the boy and hold him with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Hagar gave her a goat skin. Abraham gave her a goat skin with water. God gave her a well. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy to drink, and God was with the boy, and he grew up. Hagar, I want to bring her onto center stage this morning. One of the most forgotten people in all the Bible. Because in her story, we see 3 things this morning. We see, for one thing, the plight of many modern mothers right here in her story. Secondly, we see the fight of many modern mothers. There's a fight on out there in this culture to save our kids and to lift them up as she did. We not only see her plight and her fight, but we see the might of many modern mothers, her strength, her power, from whence it came, and what it was that turned her circumstances and situations that looked so hopeless and helpless into something where God came alongside her and blessed her and her boy. First of all, I want us to turn our attention in verses 14 through 16 at the beginning of our text to the plight of many modern mothers. And when we read these first 3 verses, we see 3 things. We see Hagar, and we see her hurting, first of all. Then we see her hungry, and then we see her hopeless. That's the plight of a lot of folks in our culture today. First of all, in verse 14, we see her hurting. Verse 14, Abraham took and he gave her some bread and he gave her some water and he sent her away. Do you see her hurting? Hagar's a victim. Her fate was not her own fault. It was the result of Abraham's impatience, his manipulation, his refusal to believe God. And because he made this wrong choice in life, we're still dealing with the circumstances of that wrong choice till this very day. But don't blame Hagar. She's an actor in this scene. And I want you to see her as God sees her. She is hurting. She's like a lot of many modern mothers today. Abraham wasn't a bad man. He was a good man. In fact, by faith, read Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham. But he made mistakes. He got into a situation where he had to make some hard decisions because of some actions he took. He loved Ishmael. He loved this boy. There was not great joy in this separation. Verse 14 says, he sent her away. Those are tough words. Hagar knew how it felt to be rejected. And so did that little boy. He loved his dad, but his dad sent him away. Talk about the plight of a lot of modern families. She was on her own. That was something new. No one to help her make decisions. Nobody to fix the car. Nobody when the faucet was leaking to fix the faucet. And note what it says in verse 14. She wandered. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know what to do. She just was sent away, and so she wandered with no real direction. Didn't know where to go, what to do. Purpose in life had been lost. This is the plight of a lot of modern mothers. And while we sit here today, let's remember that those we're called to reach with the good news of the gospel, and those to whom Jesus went and spent his whole ministry among, were those who had been rejected. And out there beyond the walls of this church today are a lot of moms who are hurting on this Mother's Day. She was sent away, rejected, wandered. But not only do we see the plight of many modern mothers in Hagar today, we see her hurting, but secondly, we see her hungry. Look at the next verse, verse 15. When the water of the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. It was bad enough to be hurting. Now their provisions are gone. She's hungry. Her resources have run dry. The emotional strain is now complicated with physical limitations and material limitations, and she's run out. And so we not only see her hurting, we see her hungry. She was hurting without protection. Now she's hungry without provision. This is the plight of a lot of modern mothers. They're down at Dallas Life today in one of those single rooms up on the second floor with their children, sent away and wandering, and they're hurting and they're hungry. But you know, it's not just for those that are on the street. There are women behind iron gates of big mansions in this city today who are hurting and who are hungry. Oh, they may have all the material needs they have, but they're emotionally starving and hungry, and they're hurting. But we see a third thing about the plight of many modern mothers here in the next verse. In verse 16, we see her not only hurting and hungry, we see her hopeless. Look at verse 16. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of my child. And she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and wept. Now we see her hopeless. She puts the boy under a tree. He's going to die. She says, I can't bear to watch my boy die. And she goes over about a bow shot away, and she gets herself under a tree somewhere, and she starts pouring her heart out and weeping and sobbing. Anybody here today can identify with her? Not just hurting and hungry, but feeling hopeless. She didn't want her boy to see her. So she got aside, got where he couldn't see her, and she started weeping. Anyone identify with that? Anybody gone into the privacy of your bedroom and shut your door and just sobbed and wept because you didn't want your kids to see you? See her hopeless? Oh, this is the plight of a lot of women and men living here in these verses. She's hurting with no protection. She's abandoned. She's wandering. She's hungry with no provision. It's all gone. And she's hopeless with no peace at the end of her rope. And the only thing left to do is cry. But don't give up. We're going to read on and look what happens next, because we turn our attention now from the plight of many modern mothers who are hurting and hungry and hopeless to the fight of many modern mothers who are fighting in this culture in which we live with their children to seek to raise them and to lift them up. And there are three things we see here in the exposition of these next two verses, 17 and 18, as we see now the fight of many modern mothers. First of all, I want you to see her expectation in verse 17. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what ails you? What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." Those words gave her a thread upon which to hang. Those words gave her a little ray of light at the end of the tunnel. Those words gave her a little crack in the door. See her expectation. "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not." It says the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. Who was this angel? Michael? Gabriel? Who was this angel? This is what we call in theological jargon a Christophany. It was a visit, not from an angel as you would think, but from the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ. You know, Christ appears in the Old Testament in various times as the angel of the Lord before his incarnation. Remember the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace? And Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fiery furnace and he said, "Wait a minute, I don't see three people in there, I see four, and the fourth is like the Son of Man." It was the angel of the Lord. It was Jesus in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And so here he shows up. He has a way of doing that with folks who are hurting and hungry and hopeless. Coming alongside, the angel of the Lord appeared to her. And look what he says, "The Lord God has heard the voice of the boy." That's an important thing. He heard the boy praying. You know, one of the things that tugged at my heart more than anything else when I was pastor of this church for those years, we had on our bulletin a prayer request form. You may still have it out, but every Monday we would take all the prayer requests that came in from the Sunday services, and we would divide them up among the staff and pray for them. And I would look at all those prayer requests on my desk Monday morning. You know what tugged at my heart? The prayers of little boys and girls. I remember the prayer of a little boy. Couldn't have been more than 6, 7, 8 years old, in block printing. "Pastor, pray for my mom. Every night when she puts me to bed, she goes in her room and closes the door, and I hear her crying, and I don't know why she's crying, but pray for her." If that tugs at our heart. Or how about I remember a prayer request from a little girl. Again, written in block letters, couldn't even write in cursive yet. "Pastor, pray for my daddy. He doesn't have a job, and every day he tries to get a job, and he's looking for a job, and I know he's hurting. Pray for him." If that tugs at my heart and your heart, how much do you think it tugs at the heart of God? Look what it says here in this verse. God heard the prayer of that little boy. Some of you need to hear these words. "Fear not, God has heard." What this mom and boy did, they called on God, and he heard them. Now see the fight of these modern moms. See her expectation. Secondly, in the next verse, verse 18, see her encouragement. See her encouragement. Look at verse 18. "Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand." How many moms are fighting today to do just that, to lift up their kids in this culture? So much of what we're about in this culture strips away pride and incentive that comes with childhood and adolescence. On the lower part of the socioeconomic scale, there are a lot of government programs that strip away by their very nature the pride and incentive in children and adolescents. And on the higher end of the economic scale, the same thing happens in another fashion. Here is a mom trying to lift up her kid in a world that's pulling him down. And it's never more true than in this culture in which we live. So many kids today feel worthless because they don't have a mom or a dad to lift them up. Some young people, we wonder why these kids get 18, 19, 20 and do these horrible things and are arrested and are thrown. Well, one of the main reasons is they've been raised in a home where they've never had a mom or dad to lift them up. All they've ever heard was, "You're never going to amount to anything. You're worthless." And when a kid hears that day after day, and the days stretch into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the months into years, they start believing it. Look at her encouragement here. She lifted that boy up. One of the most important tasks a parent can do is lift that child up. Tell that child every day you're proud to be their dad. You're proud to be their mom, that with Christ they can do anything. And lift them up. Build self-worth. Build self-esteem. Build self-respect into the lives of those children. It's a fight for many of us. But look at Hagar. If she can do it, we can do it. See her expectation. See her encouragement. She lifted up. And thirdly, in this fight, see her example. Look what else it says in verse 18. And hold him fast with your hand. What does that mean? Take him by the hand. This is parental responsibility. Hold him with your hand. Walk with him. Show him the way. Lead by example in the home. Take that child by the hand and walk with them. Don't leave them to themselves. If you look behind the most productive lives, you know what you'll find? You'll find a mom or a dad who took them by the hand and walked with them. Who were there, who were doing just what Hagar was doing in verse 18, lifting them up and taking them by the hand and walking with them. They're there. Fight is on for many modern moms. Do you see Hagar? See her expectations, calling on God, and he heard her. See her encouragement, lifting them up. See her example, walking with him. And finally, we turn our attention from the plight of many modern moms to the fight of many modern moms, finally to the might of many modern moms. We see it in verses 19 through 21. First of all, see her provision in verse 19. Look at the next verse. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. See her provision? Earlier, she was hurting and hungry and hopeless. And then the fight was on. And she called out to God, and she lifted the boy up, and she took him by the hand. And now we see God getting into action. And look at her provision. God became her provider. Abraham gave her a goat skin full of water, and God gave her a well of water. You get the picture. She's agonizing. There are no resources. And all the while, right nearby, there's a well. A well is an important thing. And I've been down in Beersheba, down in the south of Israel, just desert. You know, if you're down there in the desert, you're under some bush or some tree somewhere, a well is a vital thing to find. And it was nearby, it says. It had been there all along. This is the spiritual state and condition of many in our city on this Mother's Day, wandering and perishing and thirsty and hungry and near hopeless without the knowledge that there's a well nearby. A well about which Jesus spoke in John 4, that he said, when you come and drink from that well of the water of life, you drink and you will never thirst again. There's a well nearby. Think about it. The well was there all the time, but Hagar didn't see it. It was overlooked until God pointed it out and opened her eyes. How many times when hope was almost gone has God shown you a well? Opened your eyes. It was there all along, and perhaps you just didn't see it. But it's not enough for the well to be so close. God had to open her eyes. Some of you have been coming for a while, perhaps, listening on television or radio. I was stopped by a man this week that stopped me. In fact, it was yesterday morning, and I didn't know him. He introduced himself to me. He said, I was on the treadmill on Sunday morning a week or two ago, and I was just going through the television channels, and I saw you preaching. You're the person that was preaching down at First Baptist. I said, yeah. And he told me about, I was preaching that morning on taking a risk. He said there was a situation in my life, and I couldn't get away from it. I was glued to it. And there was something that God spoke directly to me about taking a risk in a certain circumstance and situation. He went on to reveal it, how he had done it. That well was there all along, but God opened his eyes to it in a word fitly spoken. That's what God does. Do you see her provision? It's not enough that the well is close. Some of you have been coming for a while. Maybe you've been listening. It's right here in the text. God is opening your eyes to show you a well. That's what's happening in your life. A lot of moms here today that testify they would have never made it without supernatural help. Fact is, God showed them a well. God opened their eyes. See her provision, but secondly, see in this might her promise. Verse 20. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. I love those words. God was with the lad, and he grew up. She held to that promise that God had given her back in verse 18. I will make him into a great nation. God always is on the side of the oppressed. Look what it says here in verse 20. God was with the boy. I want to tell you something. You read the Gospels and you find where Jesus was. He always came alongside the oppressed, the rejects of society, those who were rejected, those who had a bum rap. He was with this boy. God was. And he grew up. He always is with the oppressed. You can't make it. God delights in coming to the rescue of folks like you. He was going through Samaria. He saw a woman at a well one time, been rejected by the city of Sychar, and he drew alongside of her and told her of that living water. Going through Jericho, he saw an old blind beggar, Bartimaeus, on the side of the road, a reject, and he stopped everything he was doing. He always comes alongside the oppressed. In Jerusalem, there was a woman being stoned for adultery. She'd been caught in the very act, and when all the religious Pharisees were pointing fingers of accusation, Jesus came alongside her. He always does with the oppressed, as we see in our verse here. Listen, if you're a child here today listening or here, being raised in a single-parent home, don't ever be jealous of a child who has both parents. God has a way of giving advantage to you. God is especially with you and for you. And often it's the child who has known struggle and sacrifice and, yes, even suffering. Yes, who sat under a tree somewhere and wept. One who has known discipline and hard work, who is better prepared for life and climbs higher than some of those who've been of privilege and have known little sacrifice. Yes, God was with the boy. She found the promises of God. Don't quit. Don't give up. And finally, we see not only her provision and her promise, but her persistence. Look at verse 21. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. What persistence is in this mom we honor today. God gave her strength to go on, and look what, she had a lasting influence on this boy. Until the time he married, she stood with him, and then she released him to his wife. A single mom in touch with God can overcome every obstacle in her path. Hagar instilled love and respect and forgiveness in her boy. And there's an interesting sideline to this, and I'll wind down. But turn to chapter 25 for just a moment and look at verse 8. Abraham, 25:8, just a page or two. Abraham breathed his last. That's just a Hebraic euphemism that means that Abraham dropped dead. He breathed his last, and he died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and I like the way it says this, and was gathered to his people. But look at verse 9. Isaac and Ishmael, this little boy that sat under the tree and wept. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. I've been to Hebron. I've been in that cave of Machpelah. I've been there to the tomb of Abraham. And what grips me about this story is, though both of those boys were there, Ishmael went back to that daddy who rejected him to honor him. Ishmael went back to show respect because of his mother's persistence. Oh, the might of many modern mothers. Their provision, he opens their eyes and shows them a well. Their promise, God is with their boy, their girl, and their persistence. You can make it. So on this Mother's Day, let's remember that our responsibility is to build the family unit, The home is the hope of America. We talk about America needing revival. America needs a revival of the home. That's where we need revival. Let's remember the plight of many folks that are out there today. They're hurting. They're hungry. Oh, maybe not physically hungry. Some of you are here today and you're hungry and thirsty, just not physically. Trying to find a void of life to be filled. You filled it with everything you thought life had to offer. Get a new car, you think that's going to fill it, and the new car smell's gone after a few weeks. Then you need something else to fill the void of life because you're thirsty and you're hungry. And you're hurting and hungry just as much as Hagar because you're not satisfied with the things this world has to offer because that void can only be filled with not something but someone whose sweet name is Jesus. See the plight of many modern mothers, hurting, hungry, hopeless. See the fight that's going on out there among them. See their expectations. God will be with them. Their encouragement. They're out there lifting up their kids. And see their example. They're taking them by the hand. And see the might. God is with them. And they have a lasting influence. Some of you may be here today like Hagar. Oh, you may not be a single mom, but you're like Hagar. You might not even be a woman, but you're like Hagar. You may never have even known rejection, but you're like Hagar. How? How is that? You're wandering. Wandering through life. You're out there in the desert place somewhere with no direction. You're not living, you're just existing like Hagar. Trying to get through. And as this word says of her that she was wandering, that's what so many do through life. Call on God today. That's what she did. Just call on God. You know what He'll do? Same thing for you He did for her. He'll open your eyes. And He'll show you a well. And Jesus said in John 4:14, when you drink from the water of the well that He will give you, you will never thirst again. And that water, that well will be in you, a well of water springing up, He said, into everlasting life. Christ came, the angel of the Lord, no longer as a pre-incarnate Christ, but as God in flesh to become sin for you, that you might become the righteousness of God in Him, to die your death on Calvary so you could live His life today, to take your sin so you could take His righteousness. By faith, through His grace. He'll open your eye and show you a well. It may be that there's someone here today that needs to be like Hagar, to take somebody by the hand and walk with them. What a beautiful story. What a forgotten lady. What a glorious gospel. Let's bow our hearts together as we pray.